Welcome to China Tech Talk, the weekly discussion of technology and startups here in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of TechNote, and as always, I'm joined by Matthew Brennan, founder of China Channel. So this week we had the pleasure of welcoming Benjamin Joffe onto the podcast. He is the director of HAX, a hardware accelerator based in Shenzhen. And I was really surprised to learn because, to be honest, I haven't talked with him that much. But I was really surprised to learn that he has been in China or been active in China for a long time. And I think that, Matt, as you and I both know, I mean, being in China or being active in China for a long time really gives you a very different perspective, I think, than a lot of different people, especially people who are just encountering the country or who are observing the country from a little bit of a distance. And so because of that, we don't talk only about hacks, but we talk about the hardware situation and kind of some broader kind of contextual things that are going on in the hardware, IP, and telecommunications space.
Yeah, definitely. A very hardware-centric episode and a great guest to have on to cover this. There's very few people I can think of who'd be more experienced. Who get a better, broader picture of the ecosystem. And we cover a variety of topics. We talk about China 2025. We talk about patents and IP. We talk about what's happened with ZTE. We're covering a lot. And it's all good stuff. Yeah, I think especially towards the end of the episode, we get deeper and deeper. And it's really good to have an expert on here like Benjamin and get his opinions on this variety of stuff going on, because especially with hardware, a lot of it's it's supply chain stuff, it's B2B area, it's very technical engineering stuff, and so we don't really get such a clear idea of what's going on unless you just speak to someone who's deep into it, because we it's not like the other topics that we talk about where it's maybe a mobile app ecosystem where you can actually use the products yourself, so quite a different world.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, there's Shenzhen is styled as the Silicon Valley of hardware. And a lot of people say that, but I think not really understanding why that is or how that came to be. And I certainly think that after we talked to Ben today, I had a much better understanding of why that is. And also, just how much of an impact the infrastructure, the manufacturing infrastructure has for startups. Software is fairly easy to iterate. You can, you develop the program and then you test it and you see how it works, and then then you kind of go back to it. But the problem with hardware is that you have to build an actual physical prototype, and doing that can take quite a long time. Whereas as we find out in Shenzhen, the time to do that because of the infrastructure, because of the history of the city, it's multiple times less than it would be anywhere else.
Yeah, we cover all that stuff. Why Shenzhen is still going to remain competitive even as prices go up, even as wages go up. All this stuff is great insights. So let's just jump into it.
So, Ben, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
Pleasure to join.
So the first question that we like to ask all of our new guests is, what's your China story? So tell us about what you've been doing and how you ended up at HAX.
Sure. So my China story actually starts in France. Funny enough. So that's where I'm from. And I studied engineering. I got curious about Japan. I learned some Japanese. And so I went to Japan first back in 2000 during the mobile boom in Japan. Like there was basically the first pre-smartphones and really sophisticated mobile services. So I lived in Japan for about 4 years. I got curious about Korea, moved to Korea for a year, discovered all the social networks, the microtransactions, the online gaming. And then after Japan and Korea, I wasn't quite sure what to do, where to go. I had just quit my last corporate job and was starting to do some consulting work about telecom, internet, mobile. And basically, I thought, okay, I've seen Japan, I've seen Korea. Why don't I take a look at China? So I moved to Beijing back in 2005. At the time where the Web 2.0 was still a thing and was in full force. And I started to try to learn about what was going on there. And gradually, basically, my visit turned into a much longer stay than I expected. I was planning to just learn a bit of the language, discover the market for about 6 months. Ended up staying for a good 6 years. And then I moved to different places and ended up joining Hacks back in 2013. So and moving to Shenzhen and working on hardware.
So what got you into Hacks in the first place? I mean, do you have like a history of working with hardware or a history of working with startups and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm a mechanical engineer, but basically most of my career has been around strategy and market research. So I ran a consultancy researching Japan, Korea, China, had a small team of consultants based in Beijing, and we're working for international clients. And gradually, we did more and more projects close to startups, sometimes for startups, once they raise at least a Series A. Like I consulted for like some of the larger Chinese or international startups about Korea, about Japan, about China, to learn about new business models, new service concepts, things that were not so visible because everybody's looking at Silicon Valley, but there's successes and good ideas elsewhere. And through that, I ended up doing a few angel investments, and I realized I really enjoyed working with really early stage startups. But as a consultant, there wasn't really a good business model there. So when Cyril, who's the founder of Hacks, invited me in 2013 to take a look, I thought, okay, that sounds interesting, and I didn't have a very good impression of Shenzhen, and I didn't realize the opportunity around hardware. But then when I visited, I saw that something special was happening. I don't know. I think sometimes you get those impressions in your life, and I had it maybe 3 or 4 times. I had it when I was in Japan with the mobile boom. I could see that Japan was so ahead of the curve. It was really, really special. Same in Korea, 2013, 2014, 2003, 2004. And then when China was starting to boom also for internet, there was also something special with some innovation. And then again, I had this impression when I visited Shenzhen. I was like, this is the early days of the supply chain opening up, and there's a lot of opportunity. And for once, this opportunity is not just a local opportunity, but really a global one. So I felt it was really, really interesting, and I ended up joining part-time and then full-time.
And what do you guys do? What have you achieved? Where's your focus? A brief summary for listeners who aren't so familiar.
Sure. So Hacks is basically a hardware investor focused on early stage hardware startups. So we were the first accelerator to focus on hardware in a very strategic place, Shenzhen, but working with international companies. So 3/4 of our investments are outside Asia and China. Half of them are from US and a quarter from Europe. We've done about 200 investments so far, and we started by doing a lot of consumer investments, and then switched gradually to B2B for enterprise, industry, and health technologies. So a number of our investments are based in China, particularly in robotics, and some of them are doing really well. Like one is quite famous in Shenzhen. It's called MakeBlock. They do robots for education. And they have over 500 staff now, and they raised a Series B over $30 million last year. So the model of Hacks is to help companies go from a very early prototype to basically a complete product, and then helping them scale. So for that, we have a team of 30 people in our Shenzhen office, where we host typically about 30 startups at any time. We invest in 4 or 5 startups every month. And then we have another branch in San Francisco that helps with fundraising, with marketing, and with sales.
Why have you seen this trend? Why is it being more business to business focused?
Yeah, so hardware itself was really difficult and expensive to do until a few years back. Shenzhen was basically a private garden for the very large companies. But as the supply chain opened more and more, and as the barrier for starting hardware companies were getting lower and lower, initially you had like simple gadgets, like connected devices, like smart things that started that basically kind of primed the pump. But then gradually you could see more and more sophisticated projects, teams with more scientists, with doctors, who decided to jump in, and even people with a lot of industry experience. And as it turns out, selling products to consumers is actually quite difficult because they don't really have, pressing needs. Everything is kind of nice to have, and they're also very price sensitive. Whereas for businesses, as soon as you can solve like an ROI situation, like basically you solve a business problem and offer them ROI, either saving time, saving money. The spending is easy to justify just based on that. So with basically more sophisticated products that are closer to industry, those deals tend to be more appealing than consumer gadgets from an investment standpoint.
Increased complexity in the actual what people are producing, and B2B actually can be much easier than B2C.
That's right. Generally, people have less knowledge. Like the image of startup founders is that they're young grads, and typically they don't have a lot of industry knowledge because they haven't worked in industry. But I would say in hardware, you can see kind of broader range of people. From I think the youngest founder we invested in was 19, but the oldest was 57. So it's pretty broad. And some of them have many years of industry experience. So that's I think that's probably a bit of a differentiator in hardware. In addition, I said like the cost of building hardware have gone down. The image is that to do anything with a physical product, you needed millions of dollars. And today we have teams going to market with less than $1 million in total investment. So it's we're not yet at the stage of software where you can do everything with just just a few thousands of tens of thousands at least to get a first prototype out. And also the big difference between hardware and software is that with hardware, you cannot really sell prototypes because, hardware is kind of physically dangerous, whereas with software, much less so. So I'd estimate that in terms of cost with hardware, we're probably where software was like before cloud infrastructure, like maybe around the year 2000 to 2005.
That's a really interesting analogy, actually. I didn't think about it that way. Yeah, software and hardware are completely different. I've always felt software is much more flexible and you can just iterate, get stuff out. But hardware requires a lot more. It's just more barriers to entry, really. It's more difficult. Do you think there's going to be a sort of breakthrough? Is something like 3D printing or something going to be able to make things easier to get things more like software?
So there is this hope, for example, of 3D printing. But so far, the real use for 3D printing is with rapid prototyping. It's not an industrial process that scales well. It's either too expensive or limited in material, or not enough high quality enough. So maybe down the road that will be the case when you have a production infrastructure. It could be actually very, very beneficial to be able to print even like custom type of products based on each customer next to the customer. That'd be fantastic. But I think we're still quite a few years away.
So Hacks is based in Shenzhen. So what exactly makes Shenzhen such a good place for a hardware accelerator?
Yeah, so people I think who haven't visited Shenzhen don't really realize the scale of it and on its benefits. But essentially, it's a place that has been built based on decades of multi-billion-dollar investments in the electronic supply chain. So you have not only all the range going from really, one-off components to multi-million unit scale for production and prototyping. So the real benefit of that is not so much on the image is that it's all about having something at low cost, but you also end up with low quality. It's not the case. What you have is that you have every quality, every scale, more or less every cost. It's not necessarily the cheapest, but what's really more important is it's the fastest. So the turnaround time for prototypes, for components, and for production is faster than anywhere else. The startups that join us, even from Silicon Valley, tell us that in a week in Shenzhen, they do more than a month back home. And that's the real advantage.
So I guess, there's been a lot of, as, China has been kind of upgrading, as the economy has gotten stronger, so have the companies, and of course, the cost of labor has been rising as well. So, a lot of the manufacturing actually has been leaving China. So how is is Shenzhen still? I mean, like, so there's that efficiency and the speed, but is it still like the manufacturing hub of China, or has that kind of moved somewhere else, or is it moved out of China completely?
So it's a good question, because it's true. Yes, the labor costs have been going up, and some of the low-end manufacturing has been moving either to other provinces or to foreign countries like Philippines, Vietnam, other places. But for electronics, the Shenzhen and Guangdong remains like the number one in the world by very, very far, because it's not just moving a factory, it's really moving an entire supply chain. And that's really complicated and very expensive to do. In addition, it's not just moving a factory and putting in, just low-end workers. There's an extremely large amount of know-how, of technicians, of production engineers. I remember reading an interview of Tim Cook discussing with Charlie Rose about why not move back Apple's manufacturing to America. And the question was like, is it about cost? And Tim Cook's answer was that no, it's not about cost. It's about skills. If you put, like, for example, all the experts in injection molding in the US in one place, you probably need, a big room to put them. In China, you would need several stadiums. So this know-how is just very difficult to find elsewhere. And China has it in droves and keeps training and pushing the envelope because they keep improving their know-how beyond what they were initially trained for.
Well, the Chinese government has released what would you say, a policy, a plan, Made in China Made in China 2025, which is trying to take this even further, moving up the value chain.
Yes.
For Chinese industry. For our listeners who aren't familiar, it seems to be quite a big deal, actually. So for listeners who aren't familiar, could you explain what is Made in China 2025 all about, and what actions are the Chinese government taking to move manufacturing even higher end in China?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting plan because the idea is to have not only to keep a lot of manufacturing local and keep serving international customers, but also it's about the creation of Chinese brands that have global relevance. So to keep the manufacturing local, what's happening is China is very quickly modernizing its industrial infrastructure. So China has absolutely no problem installing robots all over the place, which is really kind of in stark contrast with what America is doing, which is all about jobs. In China, it's all about efficiency and quality. So the government is supporting factories to modernize with robots. They're basically subsidizing a lot of that. So that will help improve efficiency and quality through automation. You even hear of things like dark factories where basically you don't need light because it's all robots. So that's on one hand is modernizing and automation. On the other hand, it's about creating Chinese products with global relevance. So there's already some companies that obviously are selling internationally. You have like older companies like Huawei, you have ZTE, you have who else do you have? You have BYD starting to export. You have Lenovo, of course, but then you also have the kind of a younger guard like DJI. You have Xiaomi. So companies that are 5 to 10 years old. And then what's interesting is you have obviously another wave and a much larger wave of companies that are younger than that and that will become global companies, but are not yet well known outside their borders. I mentioned one of Hack's portfolio companies called MakeBlock, where it's a robotics company with already 500 people with tens of millions in revenue. And that sells more than half of its products outside China. So it's already a Chinese global company. It's just not very famous. Or you have companies like Ninebot that do the personal transporters. Those guys bought Segway and are operating internationally under the Segway brand. But essentially, it's a Chinese company. So those are kind of interesting. If we talk about hardware products, this is really what it's about. It's about creating Chinese companies that don't look Chinese, just like back in the day, you could say Sony tried to become international by changing its name from like Tokyo Electric something a name that sounded much more international.
But it feels like that transition. I mean, so I first heard about this type of movement maybe about 2 years ago, and it seems like in those 2 years, there's been a lot of progress that's been made on that front, where you have more and more companies like you were saying that are just able to really push out and to create, like you said, a kind of a global brand. But I mean, like what's been the is it the manufacturing that's been able to do that? Or, I mean, like, how is it that because Chinese companies have always had a bit of a problem, especially with branding, either because they go with a Chinese name and no one can pronounce it, or maybe, their marketing team is local. Maybe the quality of the product is seen as shoddy. So, I mean, like, what's changed? All of that, or is there something else going on?
I think you could say the marketing and the quality are not really the causes. I think really the key is that we know China can manufacture anything. They manufacture the Apple products. So once you know how to do that, you can make pretty much anything. The problem is, can you come up with original ideas, and can you sell it? Can you sell those products? And I'd say there was so much to do in playing catch up and in running businesses, and there wasn't a lot of hardware entrepreneurs until recently. But now it's seen as an opportunity, and there's a lot of engineers in China. There's a lot of engineers trained either in the best Chinese schools or internationally. There's like hundreds of thousands of Chinese who have studied in U.S. universities and universities in Europe, in Australia, in a bunch of places. So there's people who have actually a lot of skills of Chinese origin, and some of them are starting to see that actually there's a lot of opportunities now to come back and to build companies. And obviously also the people trained locally who've been less exposed to global best practices, but still can be really sharp guys and girls. They actually go into business and they come up with original things. So the founder of DJI, for instance, was trained in Hong Kong, and then now is running a company in Shenzhen. So that's one example. So basically, I think the challenge was that until recently, there wasn't that many people who were trying to push the envelope with original ideas and confidence, because there was a lot of gaps to fill in the market. But now I think they realized that it's possible to create original products and be successful. On our side, for example, at Hacks, over the past 2 years, we've seen an increase of the number of high-quality Chinese teams and Chinese products that are really original. So we invested in particular in a number of robotics companies making things that we haven't necessarily seen elsewhere. We have one company called YoiBot. They make robots for vehicle inspection. So there's a lot of actually vehicles that need inspection. For example, for buses, they need their wheels inspected regularly, so that they don't blast and they don't end up killing a bunch of people. There's like vehicles at customs also need inspection when they have cargo, and all this sometimes generally requires basically a person to spend a lot of time to do that, and it's not very efficient, and the robot can do it a lot more efficiently and a lot more safely. So we see a lot of really interesting companies coming up. But generally, they're not very visible outside China because they start by selling their products in China, which is the market they know better. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that many Chinese companies actually don't really target Western markets because the product is sometimes not suitable, or sometimes because they don't have yet the knowledge and ability to sell internationally. I can give an example. Like Xiaomi is making products that are not particularly original. They're fairly commoditized, but they're good quality, but they don't sell internationally because on the one hand, they might not have initially the knowledge to do that, particularly in Western markets where it's very competitive and brands are very established, but also because in some cases they have to overcome the issue of some international IP, or simply to have the right people to do this job. Xiaomi is actually kind of a difficult brand to pronounce outside China, so it's pretty clearly not been thought through when it was created as an international brand. But now, like being called Mi and like after a few years, they have a better shot, and they have intentions to go international beyond emerging markets.
Interesting. Yeah, so I would definitely agree. There's a rise of Chinese companies who are being more innovative. There's definitely a push from the government. I want to talk about next about actually how much progress is China making in setting global standards for hardware and manufacturing now. There's been a couple of examples that come to mind recently. Huawei has spent a lot in 5G, and they're trying to get more involved in the global process of setting those standards. And also with One Belt, One Road, high-speed rails, China's using that as a way to export their standards in that area. And standards for manufacturing are really, really important. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, so to talk about, since you mentioned telecom standards and 5G, I actually used to work in telecom, and I still have quite a bit of familiarity with that. And it's really interesting, and it's something most people don't really think about or care about or know about. But it's actually sometimes really important for industry. For example, actually standards are a really long game. Like standards take many years to be established. It's a negotiation. It has a lot to do with the soft power of countries and also companies. And China, just like Japan before it, has realized that intellectual property, patents and licensing cost a lot of money. Japan had to pay enormous amounts for licenses for semiconductors. China had to do that too. For telecom, many of the patents, original telecom patents, were actually either in Europe around GSM or in US around a standard called CDMA. People think that the giants for telecom are Apple and Google, but those guys, they didn't know anything about telecom until 10 years ago. So a lot of the patents were not in their hands, and one of the reasons Google actually acquired Motorola is to have access to their patents. Once you have a lot of patents, you can start to do cross-licensing. Means you tell other people that you don't pay their license fees, they don't pay your license fees on fundamental technologies around 3G protocols or radio systems. So China had pretty much no IP, but they didn't have a lot of China didn't have a lot of local patents registered. So the problem for Chinese is that they could make things locally, but they couldn't easily export it because of cost of those patents. So they started to work at trying to compete with their own standard about 10 years ago, a standard called TD-SCDMA that probably people don't need to know about. But that standard was one of the big reasons why Apple couldn't sell its phone to China Mobile users. And China Mobile is the biggest telecom operator on the planet. That was because of standards, because the iPhones were not working with the Chinese standard. So that started about 10 years ago. And as we evolved from 3G to 4G to 5G, China and the Chinese players in telecom kind of upped their game and are now part of the definition of standards instead of trying to create a separate one. So that puts them in a much better position. You mentioned that in industry it also applies, and it does. But overall, is just to understand that standards are a game that it's very sophisticated, it's very long term, and China is one of the few players that can actually play that game because they can have long-term planning. They have a lot of resources, and they're very patient.
Yeah, so before I joined TechNote, I was working for a localization service provider, and our largest client was Huawei. So I was able to get a firsthand look at some of the their communications, internal and external. So mostly training materials and things like that. So this was like 2 or 3 years ago now, and even then they were talking about 5G, and they were very proud that they were actively involved in setting the standard when it comes to 5G. And the thing is, for Huawei, I mean, it's a double win for them, because not only are they making the phones with the 5G standard that they helped to create and that they can be in on the ground level in terms of making and providing the actual hardware technology for the phones, but then also, of course, for the actual telecommunications equipment itself. And that's what's so interesting about Huawei as a company, because they're not just doing phones, which I think a lot of people are fairly aware of. They're also doing base stations and other types of telecommunications equipment. And so the fact that they were able to get in on the ground level to define these standards and to shape them the way it would be beneficial for them is a huge win.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, you could say it's almost the other way around, because Huawei started as some kind of local competitor to Cisco. So they actually come from the telecom network world. And it's probably the main reason why they have such an intimate knowledge of radio systems, is because they've been working on networks for basically 2 decades. And they're in fact relatively new to phones. So I don't think for a standard mobile handset company, it's easy to help define standards. Generally, the network people define the standards, and the telecom operators define the standards. So the people who build the equipment and the people who operate them. The mobile phone is generally, like, could say the lowest, like the end, the tail of the dragon. Even though that's what everybody sees and everybody has in their hands. I think a company like the guys making chipsets also, they're also very active. Like guys like Qualcomm, very active on standards, very, very active. Sometimes it's even a political battle. So you mentioned about like the connection with the One Belt, One Road. Well, just after the Iraq War, in the first one, in 2003, there was a political argument. What kind of mobile network should be built in Iraq? Should it be a CDMA standard based on the US standard, or should it be a GSM standard? Based on what every single country around Iraq was actually using. And there was actually a bit of a political battle. And there was a senator based in California who was basically defending the interest of, defending American interest and the interest of Qualcomm in particular, was saying, well, we won the war. Let's put a CDMS standard. So, sometimes there's a lot of soft power around standards and businesses, and sometimes it's part of the military package. Almost, you could say, like the Marshall Plan was in Europe after the war.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you even look at Hong Kong. Just really simple stuff like the influence of the British there in terms of standards of what side of the road you drive on, or what you call the first floor rather than the ground floor. All of these things filter through.
The electric plugs. Just look at the shape of the British standard, right? So those kind of yeah, and it's true that China, who's building basically a lot. So China is trying to access resources in Africa. To do that, they need infrastructure. Africa on its own doesn't have the cash and know-how to build it. So China is bringing the whole package. Is bringing the expertise in infrastructure, and China is very good at infrastructure, like train, electricity, and a lot of other things, and of course manufacturing, mining, and all those things. And part of the package is basically to, set that. So it's definitely part of the, you could say, soft power, thanks to the fact that they can make really long-term plans. That's one of the advantage of a government that doesn't have democratic elections. That if it's well played, you can make really long-term plans, and that's one big advantage.
So are you suggesting that there's a connection between Huawei and we can talk about ZTE in a second and the Chinese government?
Well, I think at some point. I'm not sure about the details, but at some point, of course, like the Chinese government wanted to create local champions, like every single country on the planet did. Like Korea supported a number of industries, like, for example, shipbuilding, automotive. It's governments want to have globally competitive companies. Now, if the question is about whether Huawei, who runs telecom networks, sends all the data to the Chinese government like the NSA did, this I don't know.
Right. No, I was just bringing it up because there's always talk about the connection between the two, and of course Huawei is very usually very aggressive in making sure that people understand that there isn't, some kind of backroom dealings going on. But I do think that your point is well made and well taken. You look at Made in China 2025, and you look at what's happened with ZTE. I mean, we just ran an article about this recently about how the ban on ZTE from the United States, so that legal action against them, how that's kind of trickling down to the development of core technology, including, of course, telecoms equipment, chips, and all sorts of things. So I guess we've mentioned ZTE a few times now. I just mentioned this new fairly new. It's been a couple weeks now. The action against ZTE. So give a bit of background then. So basically, the ZTE. So there's a ban on exporting certain types of technology to Iran, and a lot of it has to do with Iran's nuclear program and whether or not they're building a bomb and so on and so on. And ZTE was caught red-handed shipping in American technology into Iran. They were told to stop. They said that they would. They didn't. Then they were told that, and then they said it was a mistake. That it was only a few employees, and that these employees would be punished. Then it turns out these employees were not punished. In fact, they were given their yearly bonus, which I think there's an interesting discussion about corporate culture differences between the U.S. and China, and the role of bonuses in the Chinese labor market. But because of that, the U.S. government said, okay, well, that was the last warning. Now we're going to put a 7-year ban on ZTE, using or acquiring any American technology. And then, of course, because of that, Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, it's super interesting how this is playing out, because the Trump administration gets to say, look, this is a big win for us. We get to look tough. And then China gets to say, well, we have to rely on ourselves to produce and manufacture this type of stuff, because if we don't, then companies like ZTE, who are maybe not global leaders, but certainly they are very important. They're a very important company for the Chinese economy. We can't let a company like ZTE die because of American sanctions.
Well, it essentially shows, I guess, the complexity of trade relations, and the fact that now with the Trump administration, there's a very high level of scrutiny on the link between trade and politics. So I guess to some extent, maybe ZTE is not that critical to the U.S. market, and it's a way to display American power with some legitimacy because of the initial ban that was established with Iran. So to me, ZTE is like a unfortunate collateral damage of broader trade negotiations.
So yeah, I mean, one of the things that you did mention was, whether or not there is some kind of national security risk. So there are people that say that Chinese hardware, especially the phones, like from Huawei or ZTE, perhaps even from Xiaomi, that's built with these backdoors. I mean, how should we interpret that? I mean, should we believe people when they say that, or do you think that it's completely impossible, or kind of where do you stand with that type of idea?
So I think technically everything is possible, but I also think that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so far, the existence of such rumors seem more like a tool for negotiation or to get a competitive advantage against them. Is just rumors. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, I just listened to the Joe Rogan podcast. He had on an ex-CIA guy who says, I mean, he has no direct knowledge. He says that if the CIA is saying it, if the intelligence service are saying it, then it must be true. So I mean, it's when it comes to intelligence agencies, it's hard to tell what's true and what's disinformation.
I assume that there is a backdoor. Like if I'm using an iPhone, I assume that there is a way for Apple to get in, and certainly the American government to get in, and vice versa if I'm using a Huawei. That's my assumption. Maybe I'm the other way, but I'm kind of made my peace with it. But I think a lot of people have strong opinions about it.
Yeah, I mean, following the NSA scandal, I think America is not in a very good position to criticize so much. But yeah, I mean, it's when everything is possible. You have like cameras and microphones on everything, so everything is technically doable.
Yeah, but that's the big question. I mean, because and I think this is a good point to make at the very least, that at least in the United States we have due process, and that there is this idea that there are certain things that the government can and cannot do. And in the case of Apple, I mean, everything is encrypted. All your data is encrypted, and the encryption key is on your phone. So unless there's a very sophisticated way to get at that encryption key, which, as Benjamin pointed out, I mean, anything is possible, and I do believe that if the NSA or the CIA, I mean, really wanted to, maybe they could, right? I'm not an engineer. I'm not quite sure. But Apple is adamant that it's not possible. You look at recent attempts over the last few years for the FBI to get access to data on Apple devices, and it's been there's obviously a legal gray area in terms of fingerprinting, face scanning, and things like that. But the whole idea, the way that Apple says these devices are built, is that it's impossible to get at the data unless you authorize the access. So whether or not there's a back door with Apple products, I think is a big question. And there's no evidence to say otherwise. And the opposite case with that is that, I mean, Android is an open system. And these Android companies around the world, so not just Chinese, they make different versions of Androids. So the technical term, I believe, is called a fork. So they basically make a new version, a customized version of the Android operating system. And the issue is how much actually is encrypted. And as we were talking before, what exactly is the nature of the relationship between these companies and the government or governments? And I think that the biggest difference between China and the US in this sense, again, is that due process. So on the one hand, yes, of course, the NSA scandal that Edward Snowden broke was a big deal, but that was mostly software companies or internet services companies, not hardware companies. And even then you saw that these companies were, it looks like everything was fairly legal, actually. I mean, the scandal wasn't whether or not it was legal what they were doing. The scandal was that they were doing it, and it was legal, because this was never revealed to the American public. But these companies were, acting in a legal manner, providing this information. It wasn't that NSA was breaking in or doing anything like that. And they were actually charging money for these information requests. Whereas in China, I mean, who knows what's happening because everything is so opaque. And so, yes, of course, say what you will about Apple or what's happening in the US with the NSA, but at the very least, we have some sort of due process, and there is fairly strong tendencies towards transparency. In China, there's nothing like that.
Well, you're saying it was legal but hidden, and it sounds like it's the same thing that is being suspected of China. I don't see a very big fundamental difference there. But it's true that the Chinese government seems to have a bit less checks and balances and transparency overall. But who knows? I don't have more information than you do on that.
It's definitely a topic that is super controversial. People feel really strongly about it, but I find that every time people discuss it, it just ends up going around in circles. Well, we should probably leave it here for now.
You notice that I'm staying silent.
It does, and I'm sure some listeners will have to disagree with our viewpoints. But before we finish the podcast, I just want to touch upon one point, which is about the area of patents and trademarks and IP protection in general in China, because I'm sure you have plenty of hands-on experience of that, dealing with that through hacks. The stereotype for so long in China has been that these things are really not respected. And if you come to build some hardware in China, for example, you're going to have a very tough time protecting your innovation, tough time protecting your brand. Is this justified? What is the reality these days?
Yeah, there's a few aspects to it. So first, I'll start by talking about the startups we invested in. So as investors, obviously, we don't want any of our company to be copied and have problems with their IP. And so far, out of the 200 companies roughly that we invested in, we haven't had really any like copycat issue. And the key reason is that they're making products that are fairly complex, particularly on the software side. So in some cases, you could, copy the hardware, but then you just get a dumb box. You could put all the chips on a circuit board, but if you don't know what they're supposed to do and you don't have the right software on it and the right algorithms that are really complicated to develop, then you have nothing. Essentially, you have basically a dead computer. So we haven't really had any IP issues, but we also know that there are risks around IP, in particular if you do much simpler products or products that don't include any software. And in that case, like Chinese factories, Chinese engineers, some of them are extremely good at reverse engineering, and they could probably redo a product and maybe even improve it. Because they have a much more intimate knowledge of manufacturing processes. So in some cases, the copy can actually be better than the original. Now, IP has evolved a lot to cover not only patents and trademarks, but also all sorts of kind of intangible IP. When I talk about software, it's mostly know-how on trade secrets. There's also IP around the way you organize your supply chain, around your customers. So I'd say there's many ways to defend a product and a business. But I'll take an example that's quite famous. Like I think everybody knows about hoverboards. So it was kind of popular, 2 years ago. So hoverboards were originally designed by a Chinese American inventor, and he designed it. He started to show it in some trade shows. He had an early prototype, and then as he was starting to manufacture it, some Chinese companies redesigned it, went around his patents, actually designed, you could say, potentially a better system and better electronics. And then, because it was actually a fairly simple product, many factories started to manufacture them. And suddenly you had them all over the place. So they got a bad name because of some battery issues, because it was a problem of battery quality and power management. But on the electronics and mechanical design standpoint, it was actually a really good product. And what happened is that eventually you ended up with a product where the ownership of the patents for the new product was actually not that clear. The original inventor looked at suing some of the other companies, but he couldn't because they created some different system to achieve the same thing. So eventually, there's like a bunch of products on market, and some are pretty good quality, but there's not many. There's no like clear inventor of the new design. It's a really kind of strange situation.
But has the general IP environment improved in China? Is you're saying for most companies, it's really not an issue because of their technical expertise. But in general, do you think it's
Yes.
Is it
That's a good question.
easier now than it was before to protect things like trade secrets, like branding, trademarks?
So yes, China has improved a lot. I think what people used to make fun of is like the shoddy quasi brands, like things that look like a McDonald's, that look like Nike, look like this, look like that, kind of were like derivatives. So China has improved a lot on that, and I think it kind of moved in locksteps with China's motivation to protect their own domestic brands as well. And I would say it seems that the justice courts in China actually don't really favor local players in that type of judgment. So, of course, you have to remember that in China has different legal system in terms of patents and trademarks. In China, is first to file. That means that even if you have made a product somewhere else a long time ago on your well-known brand on the market, the first to file your brand or your patent in China will own it. And I think Apple actually had to buy something like the iPad trademark or something in China, paid something like $60 million. I don't remember exactly the numbers. For the trademark, because they hadn't filed the trademark and somebody else filed it. So this is like the local legal system, and not every country has the same. America is one, and China is a different one, and some other countries might have different ones. So I think on the trademark and patent, generally it works pretty well. That said, when you're a startup, trademark is cheap, is quick. Patents, you can file like provisionals and do stuff like that, and it's pretty cheap. But defending a patent is a totally different story. If you're a startup and you have a very aggressive copycat and or very aggressive competitor, and you're trying to defend a patent, well, good luck to you, because it's going to cost you years and millions of dollars wherever you do it, in China, in US. So generally, if you're at that stage where you have to actually defend a patent, you're really in trouble unless you really have very, very strong case and you can find people to back you with money to actually defend it. So it's not an easy battle, but overall the situation has been improving a lot in China for both domestic and international companies.
Awesome. Have any of your companies had to defend their trademark or their IP in some way? And if so, what was the result?
Not that I remember. I heard that some companies have faced trouble because if you run a Kickstarter, there might be somebody in China, if your Kickstarter is successful, that will file your trademark in China and then use that either to sell it back to you, and same as internet domain names. Some people might register the Chinese domain for your company name. But I think that happened maybe to a couple of our companies that mentioned that somebody like filed a China trademark, so they had eventually to file a slightly different trademark. But aside from that, we haven't really seen any convincing copycats. Funny enough, actually, MakeBlock, the company I mentioned based in Shenzhen, making robots for education, one of our earlier investments, that's doing very well. They had some copycats from China, even though they're Chinese themselves. And what they said about it is that the quality of the products that those copycats were doing, particularly on the software side, was so low that they never really achieved anything. So it wasn't really ever a big problem for companies. But the companies we invest in typically have a very strong barrier of entry in terms of software or science. And it's not something that, a run-of-the-mill factory can actually manage.
Right. Makes sense. Maybe as a final question, is there any Chinese companies, Shenzhen hardware companies that you're particularly excited about now, and any tips for our listeners for future stars to watch out for?
Yeah, so I have a few I like. So DJI is famous enough that probably don't need to mention, but I'm a big fan of Ninebot. I think they're based in Beijing, but of course they make all their stuff in Shenzhen. And I really like what they do. I think they're very innovative. And I think that's really a key to understand that it's not just about coming up with an idea. It's about building a product, and it's about building an affordable product. So Segway had been around for over 15 years, but hardly anyone had one because it was so expensive. It was like $5,000-$6,000 to get one. And Ninebot came up with their mini thing that's less than $500 and works really well. And I think that's really the role of democratizing innovation is just as important as coming up with groundbreaking ideas. So big fan of Ninebot. After that, well, I'm pretty big fan of the companies we invested in. Some of them based in Shenzhen, some are a bit outside in other places in China. In robotics, for example, there's one I really like called Plecobot. They make a robot that works a little bit like a pleco fish in aquariums. They basically stick to high-rise windows, and they can clean the entire facade of the high-rise. And there's a lot of windows to clean in China. The one doing inspection robot called UiBot, I'm really big fan. I guess those are the ones that kind of come to mind. In terms of others with kind of international ambitions, I think there's Insta360. There's a few software companies, a few hardware companies doing 360 cameras that are pretty good. For hardware, who so far there's not that very many names. But I expect that there will be more and more as time go by.
Well, great. Yeah, no, this has been a really good episode. So Ben, just before we go, where can our listeners get in touch with you, or where can they find you?
So if they're working on a hardware startup and they have a prototype, they can head to hacks.co. hax.co to apply to our program. And if they want to find me, they can go on Twitter, Benjamin Joffe on Twitter. I also write on Medium, same name. And they can also email me at ben@hax.co if they want to keep it private.
Perfect. Well, Ben, thank you so much again. And that's about all the time we have for this episode of China Tech Talk. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a review on iTunes. If you're on Overcast or Pocket Cast, you can tap on that star button and it will recommend this episode to your network. And if you want to get in touch with either Matt or I, you can find our contact details in the show notes. In case you didn't know already, TechNote has a plethora of daily and weekly newsletters to keep updated on what's happening in Chinese tech. In particular, the ones that I'm most proud of are our daily briefing that goes out 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. It's a curated summary of what other media have been saying about China, both in Chinese and in English. And then our thrice weekly newsletter, the China Funding Daily, which looks at the largest fundings of the week.